The topic I'm talking about for the next 3 weeks is about mysticism. And part of it's the fact that as a minister, one of the things that I do is to sort of help people get to the place where, as the title of this talk is, to live in the deep end of your soul. And Daniel's song certainly gave most people the experience of moving to a deeper place in your heart. And that's precisely what the talk is designed to do too. So to get us started, I'm going to have Reverend Liz Lowell read to you from the front of the program something that Ernest Holmes wrote about that higher consciousness.
Dr. Buck defines cosmic consciousness as one's consciousness of her or his unity with the whole. The mystic intuitively perceives truth and often without any process of reasoning, immediately is aware with what Swedenborg called a sort of interior awareness, a spiritual sense. There can and does descend into our minds, embody and personify in our person a divinity, a unity, the Spirit of God, the direct incarnation of the original thing in us, the mystical presentation of Christ. Dean Inge, perhaps the best thinker in the Anglican Church of today, tells us that Plotinus had 7 distinct periods of cosmic consciousness in which he was so completely unified with the universe that he became one with it. His spiritual philosophy was a result of these experiences. Plotinus, you will recall, was one of the greatest of the Neoplatonic philosophers.
Why, of course they recall that. You know Plotinus. Probably not. But that's the way with most mystics, is that most people are not aware that there's somebody operating at that level, and it's a deeper level than most of us operate. Most of us operate on the surface of who we are, rarely going deeper into our sense of self. And at the surface, there's some very specific phenomena that happens. Most people learn how to live on the street on the surface of their life, meaning they learn how to get along, make a living, sort of establish status and presence and such. And consequently, as they sort of live on the surface of who they are, they also develop ways to manipulate, if you will, life. So they get life to do what they want it to do when they want it to do it, most of the time. But mystics drop way deep below all of that operation. And they go to a place where the sense of who they are is a sense of oneness and unity with life. Now, if you've not experienced that sense, then that is something that is the aim of this service, is the aim of the center, is to provide a place where you could not only heal any sense of separation between you and God, but you can actually feel the presence of God's love. As a matter of fact, of the top of your program, it says, Plotinus, I think I got this right, said that God did not walk away from us, we walked away from God. And so people have a tendency to walk away from God, and they don't even know they're walking away from God. The experience I had just this last week, I was up in Seattle with my wife, Patty, and we were there for her mother's memorial. Her mother passed away about a week ago. And we were up there to be that presence of love and support, but also to go through our own grief process. But we were staying in her mother's house while we were up there, which is 2 doors down from her sister. And we walked in, and already her nephew had moved into the house and sort of turned it into a, well, what young people would call a place for other young people to gather. So we'll suffice to say that. But what happened is the initial reaction was an invasion of one's sacred space. So your mother's house is like, it's a sacred place. And yet here was young people there sort of invading that place. And we were having to sort of deal with our own judgment around that. But that's that surface stuff that makes it hard to integrate those kinds of experiences without getting angry or resentful. So I'll tell you what happened as we go with that. So anyway, we're up there and we hit the ground on Thursday morning. We go right into the business of getting the food ready for the reception after the memorial, talking to the minister who was handling the memorial, talking to him for about an hour and a half, and then finally getting back to the house to go to bed, wake up the next morning and go right into breakfast and getting the house ready for that memorial reception, and then actually viewing the memorial, and going through all the range of emotions. And if you've never been to a memorial, I'm sure many of you have been, you know that the range of emotions are so high and low, it just really is almost impossible to get yourself ready for that kind of experience. But if you don't have any tools at all of how to deal with it, you can look around and you can see in the faces and expressions of people, they're lost. They don't know what's appropriate, they don't know how to respond. Many people are hugging, there's a lot of crying, there's even laughter going on. It's the most sort of awkward social experience that people have. But that's precisely what it's like to go deeper into your soul. It's an awkward experience of an emotions, of feeling this amazing, what we would call in philosophy, an epiphany, a bliss, if you will. And not everybody experiences that. A lot of times people say, well, what are they talking about? What is this unity of being that you're suddenly feeling? So I knew why I was there. I was there to hold the consciousness and to be as much of a guide as possible in the expression of unconditional love. No judgment, just love. And Patty did the most amazing eulogy of her mom. And there wasn't anybody else in the family that was equipped both to do that. So what she did was to integrate all the pieces of her mom. And her mom would say things like, when the kids were asking for things and they didn't have a lot of money, her mom would say, well, people in hell want ice water. So it was like, characterize how a person's sense of proportion and how they're trying to sort of deal with the loss and the humor of her mom, too. Her mom had a great sense of humor. But her mom came from a family that was not easy. Very, very poor, from Ohio, and literally raised in a very urban society with no indoor plumbing and abuse going on too and things like that. Made her very hard on the outside. But still, if you got to know her, you'd discover there was a mush ball under that hardness. Know anybody like that? Hard, but a mush ball. And the thing about a hard person is they don't ever want their cover blown. They don't want people to know that they're that soft. As a matter of fact, hard people are sometimes harder because of that. And that's a piece of information to hand on to you. So when you run into people, boy, what a crusty person that is, or other names that you might apply to that person, you might be saying to yourself, the reason they're that way is because their heart just doesn't know how to handle love. They don't know how to be loved. And even if they were loved, they would absolutely collapse under the overwhelming sense of acceptance. I know that may be hard for some people to understand that about hard, difficult people. They're not really hard, they're not really difficult. They're just scared. That's what fear is. Fear makes you hard. Sometimes it makes you resolve, thinking that the best thing in life would be a good character lesson that causes you to fail so much that you become even harder, even more resistant to being loved. But if you come here long enough, we will wear you down, I promise you. We will find ways to get into your heart. It'll be through Daniel's music, or it'll be some other artist, maybe one of our practitioners, but one day, you're going to feel it. And when you do, there will be no words to describe it. No words. When you get to your heart. So, Meister Eckhart was a Dominican monk in the 13th century, what we call the Middle Ages. And he had gone past that surface religion, that Catholicism that he was, that he blessed and thanked he could finally go to the well and he could start experiencing what Plotinus called oneness, which came from an idea from Plato, believe it or not, who he and Socrates had established this consciousness of unity, and that there were perfect humans. There's one perfect human, and all of us were variations on that perfection. And sometimes when I'm counseling people and I tell them that, you're perfect, whole and complete just the way you are. They're living so much on the surface that they cannot hear those words. All they can hear is their imperfections. All they can hear is the judgments that have been cast against them. All they can see or sense is their conviction that life is maybe worth living. Maybe. but not really. And so to get them to that place to release that, we have to get them into the deep end of that pool, which means there has to be teachers. And that's what I do, I teach. I'm not necessarily a mystic, but I certainly have gone to the place where the oneness exists. But Meister Eckhart, he went there. He felt it. It was a presence. It was something so powerful that he began to emanate this presence. And people began to take notice. I gave you a little yellow cheat sheet of some of the things that he said. He said at number 5, you may call God love, you may call God goodness, but the best name for God is compassion. When you find compassion in your heart, that's when you really begin to mature. That's when maturation really starts to happen. One time I was blessed with the opportunity to go see the Dalai Lama. Has anybody ever seen the Dalai Lama? When he walks in the room, didn't you just automatically feel the energy? I mean, it just shifts. And you can tell that this guy is dedicated to compassion. He would even say about the people that are supposedly his enemies, the Chinese government that took over Tibet, he would say, hold them in compassion. Hold them with love. They're just not knowing who they are. He would never speak negatively about anybody. As a mystic, that's what mystics do. They don't speak in the negative because they're not subject to the surface. They're subject to the deeper part of their souls and their hearts. Another thing he said is that the eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. When you look upon the world in disdain, discomfort, and disappointment, and unhappiness, and things like that, do you realize you're looking at a mirror? And that's what God is looking back, reflecting back to you, that emptiness that you're feeling, until you finally realize, wait a minute, I've got to change my mind. I don't have to change God's mind. I got to change my mind about who I am and how I'm functioning. Now back to Seattle. So we're at the end of the memorial service, and it's been a long day. We're at my sister-in-law's house. We're all eating, and finally I get so tired I have to go to bed. I'm just exhausted. So I walked back over to the house, and I walked into the house, and there on the couch, my mother-in-law's sacred couch, are sitting 5 young gentlemen who were there to play video games. Now, I know, see, look at the disdain we have about that. How disrespectful. But you know, it took me 24 hours to finally see it, but I finally did see it. They were waiting for a bus. They were there, not knowing who they are, and they didn't know where else to go, and there happened to be a home open, so in they went. And they're sitting there, trying to figure out who they are, while they're playing the video games. Now that is the nature of many young people. Many young people are engaged in just sort of killing time while they try to figure out how to live their lives, and also how to meet the expectation of their parents and their loved ones and their peers, etc., etc. Once I could see that, from that sense of compassion, because I knew that Patty's mom was a great lover of sort of misfits and lost folks, because she would take people in, and I thought, what a perfect tribute to her, that her home then would become a place for lost souls, so to speak. But the reason I'm saying that is because without that compassion, I would have walked away angry, thinking space has been violated. Things have been done wrong here. We need to fix this. How would we fix it? By chastising those people who are equally confused, who would become even more confused by our judgment, by our anger. So, what a healing takes place when I can guide myself back to a higher way of thinking. Now that's what teachers do. Teachers teach themselves ways to think about things so they don't have to live in any sort of sustained doubt or desperation. And doubt and desperation are rampant nowadays. People doubt themselves, and people are feeling really desperate, especially about employment and things like that, and relationships are under more pressure than ever before. So what if you had a set of tools that would be as effective as anything you could find at Sears? Effective in really putting yourself back in position again, so you could do the 3 things that a mystic and a teacher want you to learn how to do. The first thing is they want you to be sighted. They want you to be able to see the things that you're not seeing right now. Now, Quincy Jones, many of you might have heard of him, very famous jazz musician, wrote an autobiography called Quincy. And in there he describes his relationship with Ray Charles, who back in the 50s he got to meet in Seattle and play with. And he was younger than Ray, but he said Ray was the most sighted blind man he'd ever seen. And he said the only time Ray was ever blind is when he was around beautiful women. I'll let that sink in for just a minute. Because Ray knew then he could play. He could play a part. But the way he would walk across streets and walk into stores and buy and shop stuff, you would think there's no way this guy is blind. Because his real sight was that he could see everything around him, but not in ways you and I can see things, but in ways that Ray could understand things. Matter of fact, when he would meet a woman, he would feel her wrist, and that would tell him what the rest of her was like. And if you had a really great wrist, Ray was interested in who you were. So the question is, are we so blind that when we run into people who are trying to get to know us, that we don't open the door for them? Because we think we have something to fear. We think we have something to be afraid of. And so when you change your mind like that, then you instantly shift your perception, and what happens? A flow of information that begins to help you understand yourself. Help you understand your own fears. Help you understand the things that you want to heal, that you want to lift yourself up to. And that's where we come to Raymond Charles Barker, a great teacher. And the difference between a teacher and a mystic, of course, is the mystic is down there having the experience, and the teacher is sort of creating the curriculum or the approach, so all of us can have that experience. And one of the things that Raymond used to say was, he said, sometimes people take out on others the things they don't solve for themselves. You ever had that experience? Somebody's anger is not really about you, but it's about something they haven't solved in their own life. Another thing he said is that no one can love you until you love yourself, and you cannot love anyone else until you love yourself. You know, a lot of people when they walk and they ask me this, well, how can I find a perfect relationship? A lot of times they say, well, how in love with you are of yourself? And they say, well, what do you mean? Am I supposed to be in love with myself? Yeah, I said, if you don't like you, why would anybody else like you? If you don't like yourself, truly love yourself, then why would anybody want to like you? And here's the odd thing about that. If people did like you, and they were trying to tell you, you couldn't hear it. Because you didn't have the internal language of your own sense of self-love. Now, I'm not talking about narcissistic behavior. I'm not talking about being self-absorbed or impressed with your own stuff. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about genuinely liking who you are and accepting who you are. Now, I'll give you an example. If you walked into my office, and some of you have, you might think to yourself, boy, what a disorganized place this is. Because I'm an artist, I'm creative. I know everything, I know where everything is in the stacks. I don't have them appropriately designed for your pleasure. I have them in places so I can get to them and pull them out. And that's the way everybody is who actually loves themselves. They trust themselves because they like who they are and they accept the way they organize things, the way they do things. That doesn't mean they can't learn better ways, but they don't judge themselves as bad or negative, so that imperfection is not going on. Now, what does a teacher do? A teacher helps you see the perfection of who you are. I remember a great master teacher, I've told this story before, Mrs. Washington. When I was teaching, I started teaching in school. I taught school for 15 years. And my first job was in inner city LA at a place called Fauché Junior High School. And I was in Fauché, and I was given the job when you're a student teacher. You kind of get the leftover classes. So I was teaching music appreciation to people who didn't appreciate music, or at least the way that you were supposed to teach it. And so when I was first out teaching, I had to have 15 different things. In case this failed, we could try this. If that failed, we could go to this. If anybody's a teacher, you know what I'm talking about. So it's like going to all those different things. And Mrs. Washington was my supervising teacher, a beautiful African-American woman who would walk in the school, and she would sit in the back of the room, and she'd take copious notes. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I must be really falling apart, because she's writing like crazy. And every time she came in, she would hand me the list of things. And she says, here's what you taught the kids today. In spite of all the interruptions, in spite of all the failures, look what you did. And I said to her, I said, what about what I didn't do right? She says, don't worry about that. Concentrate on what you're doing right. And from then on, I trusted her judgment. People don't trust each other because if they know all they're ever going to hear from you is what they did wrong, then that is never going to work for them. But if they hear from you what they did right, then they're going to trust you. Now, I know sometimes it's hard to find the right things that people are doing because you've got to look a little bit deeper, a little bit more clearly. So you've got to be sighted, you have to have conviction, and you have to have compassion. So when you're working with people, you don't see the negative person. Now, sometimes in this incident with my in-laws, there was some imbibing going on, drinking. And the more people lost sight of who they were, the more they lost sight of who and why they were there. And so what did I have to do? Look upon that in judgment? No. I had the compassion to say, I'm hoping that one day this person wakes up and sees that's inappropriate and not necessary, that they can handle their pain a different way. Compassion requires you to see the good in the person even when they're not behaving well. And when you have that kind of compassion, they see it on your face. They see it in your facial expression. They know you're not judging them, but you're sitting there thinking to yourself, there's got to be a different way that you can experience love. And that's precisely what mystics do. They show you the way to experience love. I remember the famous mythologist, the guy who wrote Power of Myth. Who was that? Joseph Campbell. And he was describing these monks who had been living in Vietnam, Buddhist monks and Catholic monks. And they got together for a 3-day festival. And the heads of their various organizations were meeting also. Now, the administrative people could only stand each other for like 24 hours, and they both left. Both the administrators of the monks and the administrators of the Catholics, they couldn't talk to each other. But the monks themselves, they spent not 3 days together, but 5 days together, because they were talking God. They weren't talking administration. They weren't talking religion. They were talking the experience of what it means to go deeper into your acceptance of love, to your acceptance of joy, to your acceptance of life. And so as they did that, they began to really talk to each other. Now, I come from an organization that used to be known as Religious Science International. And there's an organization that was sort of in competition called United Religious Science. And these two organizations were one at one time. And in the 1950s, they had a personality dispute over something. And they split into two organizations. Now, I got into this teaching in 1972. I know I don't look that old, but I did, in 1972. And when I got into it, I didn't even know another organization existed until I heard rumors about these other people, the other people. And so sometime around, I don't know, the mid-90s or early 90s, we started to say, maybe we shouldn't be separated. Maybe we should be together, doing the same good work. And so we started talking to each other. And out of that conversation, approximately 20 years later, we both dropped our old identities and got back together as one organization. That may not mean something to many of you in this room, but to me, who had heard all about the others, and the others, and the others, to finally heal that and bring them together. And last year, they had their second conference together, and they elected a new community leader, basically the leader of the entire new organization called Centers for Spiritual Living. And we're honored to have Dr. Ken Gordon here today, who's the new elected leader of the Centers for Spiritual Living. I'm going to invite Ken to take that microphone right there. No, we're not. We're going to sing. Now, what you need to know is Ken and I have been friends since the 1980s. That's when we met each other as new ministries of Religious Science International. And I've been up to Kelowna, Vancouver, or Kelowna, British Columbia, where his church is. And it's an outpost. I'm just teasing. It's not an outpost. It's a thriving city. So why don't you tell them a little bit about your feelings about finally coming together as one organization?
First off, I really want to thank you for being here and for honoring me by just bringing me up and being present. And I want to mention how brilliant your teacher, Dr. Jim, is. celebrate this beautiful space. This is just beautiful here, isn't it? Are you comfortable here? You like it? Yeah. When Dr. Jim was talking about Joseph Campbell and talking about how the administrators couldn't spend more than 20 minutes in a room together, and how yet the mystics could spend 5 complete days because they were speaking about God, I have to let you know that the integration process of United Centers for Spiritual Living and International Centers for Spiritual Living was based by and from all of us on that exact premise. Every time we got involved from a point of view of administration or for the temporal things that exist in the world, what happened was all of the differences showed up. They all started to present themselves, and those differences would take us to that human aspect of our being where certain people, myself included at times, would begin to tear it apart like shredding a piece of chicken before you eat it. And when that occurred and when that happened, what would happen is the differences would show up, and we began to focus on what was different between the organizations. And that would bring fear forward because the natural thought was that we were going to lose something then. But I took this, and I know Dr. Jim did as well, and we took it from a point of view that said that this was a spiritual practice, it wasn't a temporal practice. It was a practice of coming together because it's the right thing to do. I'm sure in your life you have things that are just the right thing to do. They don't make any logical or linear sense sometimes, they're just the right thing to do. And so what we did was we entered into that as a spiritual practice. And I would like to say that the people who maintained that spiritual practice over the 7 or 8 years of consistent work that it took to make it happen were really the ones that helped bring it together and make it work. In the meantime, there were people bringing together the bits and pieces and the temporal parts of it to be able to fit it together so that everything would be perfect, or everything would be fine, or everything would be okay in the future. And then there are those of us who just surrendered to say that this must happen because it's the right thing to happen. The reason it's the right thing to happen is because we have to stay in our own principles. We have to be congruent with what we teach. And we teach oneness, therefore we have to show it on the outside. I caught myself actually looking at the circumstance once when I heard about a talk called the Abraham Walk. And the purpose of the Abraham Walk was to walk from Istanbul through to Jerusalem. And the reason that that was going on, presumably, was to take a message to the Jewish and to the Palestinian people to be able to tell them that they should get together and work together. And when I was invited to do that, I really found that there was a problem that I had, and that is that I couldn't even get along with my brothers and sisters in the same faith. So how on earth could I have the arrogance to try to tell somebody else to do it? So therefore, what happened was it was a requirement that I begin to live in the principles that I teach before I could point it out to anyone else or anyhow else. So there is a greater vision within Centers for Spiritual Living today, possibly, than there was between United and International. And the vision is this. It's exactly what Daniel was speaking about when he mentioned that he just wants to see the world come together and sing and pray together. That's precisely what I believe it's time for us to do. If we can integrate with that self of ourselves, then it's possible for us to be able to integrate with everyone else in the world. And as we do that, what happens is we will develop a collective consciousness. And as we develop the collective consciousness, what will happen is we will be recognized in the world for our teaching. And when I say our teaching, it just happens to be called Science Aligned. But the reality is it is the basis of all of the major traditions in the world. A teaching is just simply that which doesn't have the dogma or doctrine or humanness that's attached to it. And it permits us now to be able to step in there and begin to operate from that point of view. I see us coming together and working closely in the future with all of the traditions. But, as Dr. Jim was pointing out today, before I do that, what I must first do is learn how to work within myself, to be able to respect and love myself. And if we take that into the macro from the individual micro, what we discover is that that practice is probably the practice that's going to elevate the world and bring the world into a place of practical mysticism. And once again, I just thank you for being here, and I want to tell you what great consciousness you must have in order to have such a fantastic teacher as you do in Dr. Jim Turrell. This thing that we called integration would not have happened if it weren't for people like Dr. Jim Turrell, and specifically if it weren't for him. This gift that he's given us is a fantastic thing. He's been very involved, and I trust will be involved again in the future. And I know this. I know that there resides within Dr. Jim the absolute mystic that sees the truth and the beauty in you. And I love it when I can stand here and watch him come to tears just by looking at you and sharing the ideas. You are blessed, he is blessed, and I am blessed. Let's bless us all. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'd like to close my talk about telling a story about Ken, because you need to know that our relationship goes back so many years. And Ken invited me up to Canada to go on a fishing trip, and I just learned how to fly fish. So I went out and spent all this money to look good. When I got up there, I had all this new equipment, and Ken had all this old beat-up equipment put together with tape and everything else. And he said, "Oh, you're new to the sport." So we went running up and down the rivers of Canada, fly fishing, and I'm like trying to negotiate locks and just barely I'm just trying to learn how to throw, and I catch like 5 fish. Ken's caught 25 fish. He says, "What are you waiting for? Come on, start catching some fish." And he's catching things that are just with stuff put together with Band-Aids practically. So that's what Canadians learn how to do, is to survive on Band-Aids. So he's a great individual. I'm really happy he's my friend. More importantly, I'm happy he's our new leader for the Centers for Spiritual Living. And I'd like to say thank you, Ken, for your friendship too. Thank you. We all have a friendship here. The unity of who we are makes the difference in the world. Don't ever take it for granted the way you think, because it makes the difference in another person's life, that you stop judging them and start loving them.